In John Carpenter's cult classic horror film The Thing, characters faced a daunting, horrendous enemy, though we're not talking about the shape-shifting alien. The unspoken secondary monster of the film is the setting. Antarctica, a frozen wasteland where being trapped outside during the wrong season means certain death. In relation to the film and the classic horror formula, Antarctica provides the isolation ingredient of the plot, meaning that characters are unable to simply run away from the primary threats, or to put it another way, the mutating alien is the lesser threat in comparison to the Antarctic winter climate. Interestingly enough, in The Thing, the character Windows briefly mentions McMurdo Station when attempting to call for help, and it just so happens that McMurdo Station, like the shape-shifting alien, is very much a real thing. Now, depending on where you are in the world, your definition of cold will vary drastically. If you live somewhere near the equator, the thermometer dipping too close to 0 degrees Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit indicates that it's time to break out the heater, pull on your warmest clothes, and dismay at the sight of your own breath fogging the air. If, on the other hand, you're one of the handful that choose to be at McMurdo Station, the exact opposite is true. Anytime the temperature hints at rising above freezing, it's the equivalent of a toasty day at the beach. McMurdo Station sits on the Ross Dependency region of Ross Island, an area that was once claimed by the UK, but now officially belongs to the relatively nearby New Zealand. The station itself is, however, part of the United States Antarctic Program, or USAP, a branch of the National Science Foundation. If you do ever happen to find yourself as far south as it's possible to go, you'll certainly hope to find yourself here. McMurdo is the official biggest community in Antarctica, home to between 250 and 1,000 people depending on the season, and is the closest thing you'll find to civilization under these extreme conditions. The station boasts a harbour, 3 airfields, a heliport, and over 100 separate buildings, including a convenience store and even 2 ATMs. But if at this point you're starting to get the impression that there is a cozy atmosphere in the most isolated, driest, windiest, and generally least hospitable location in the world, well, that depends on the temperatures you're personally willing to endure. If cooling minus 10 degrees Celsius, 14 Fahrenheit, unusually warm, sounds like your cup of tea, then maybe McMurdo Station is cozy after all. For those that spend long periods of time there, primarily the logistics and support staff, the real challenge is that an unusually warm minus 10 Celsius can very suddenly turn to minus 30, depending on the wind chill factor. That's minus 22 Fahrenheit. Speaking of logistics and support staff, they make up the majority of the population at McMurdo most of the time, as opposed to the researchers and scientists that you're perhaps imagining. As it turns out, most activity at McMurdo is concerned with, above all else, simply trying to ensure that the facilities remain functional and that the structures don't become part of the surrounding frozen wasteland. The Antarctic is incredibly hostile for most of the year, and so all activities, scientific research included, tends to happen only during a relatively small percentage of time. The warm months between December and March are when maintenance staff and researchers rush to get as much done as possible, aware that the brief hiatus from dangerously cold temperatures will end suddenly and unpredictably. And unpredictably is, by the way, the key characteristic of this region, and it isn't uncommon for maintenance projects and scientific research to be postponed or frozen over until the following warm season. The safety of those working in the Antarctic is always a top priority, including the lives of those at the many smaller Antarctic bases surrounding central McMurdo. Amazingly enough, despite how unforgiving the landscape is and how costly and time-consuming maintaining life there can be, the Antarctic is bustling with activity, relatively speaking. Stations from over 50 nations dot the otherwise entirely uninhabitable landscape, and McMurdo is widely considered to be the central hub. It's probably safe to say that without McMurdo and the USAP, there would be much less happening in the region, which is something that we'll get to in more detail shortly. But before we do, let's answer the question you're probably wondering. Should you pack that extra sweater for your trip to McMurdo? Well, this may come as a shock, but McMurdo is actually the premium real estate as far as Antarctica is concerned. The construction location was chosen very carefully, with the original teams deciding on this particular spot because it's protected from the bitterly cold seasonal waves that sweep over from the Antarctic interior. The trans-Antarctic mountains act as a shield against these waves, meaning that it rarely hits below minus 40 degrees Celsius, which is actually the same in Fahrenheit, and if you know the Antarctic, you'll know that that is actually a serious luxury. In the warmest December and January months, temperatures even sometimes rise above freezing, with the highest temperature ever recorded in 1987 being a scorching 10.8 degrees Celsius or 12.5 Fahrenheit. The lowest recorded temperature at McMurdo, meanwhile, was minus 50.6 Celsius, which is minus 59 Fahrenheit, which just goes to show that it's all a matter of perspective, and that yes, you probably should pack that extra sweater. It's a joke, you need as many sweaters as you have. If you're further wondering, the coldest temperature ever recorded in history was minus 94 Celsius, that's a minus 137.2 Fahrenheit at the eastern Antarctic plateau, though this was done remotely. The plateau is further inland from McMurdo, well beyond the protective mountain range, and can be considered the coldest location on Earth. The coldest temperature ever directly recorded was at the previous Soviet Vostok Antarctic Station in 1983 of minus 89.2 degrees Celsius or minus 128.5 Fahrenheit. And that brings us to the next most obvious question. Just how do people survive in one of the most isolated and inhospitable places on Earth? The United States Department of Agriculture recommends that you store frozen foods at minus 17.8 degrees Celsius or 0 Fahrenheit for best results. So, by that logic, if you were to crawl into a freezer during the Antarctic winter, you'd be better off, assuming that the freezer is running, of course, which is no small ask, given that the nearest reliable power station is a few thousand kilometers away. Power is, without question, one of the largest ongoing concerns at McMurdo, which probably goes without saying. The requirement of having diesel flown in annually is a serious logistical challenge that occupies much of the annual schedules of the logistics personnel, and truth be told, the situation hasn't been improving to any significant degree. There was, however, an effort to ease the situation by the US Navy in 1962. The Navy decided that a nuclear power plant was the best option, thus designing the specialized PM-3A nuclear reactor. The PM-3A, small and light enough to be transported in an LC-130 Hercules, was to be the new electrical heart of McMurdo, officially taking over much of the daily power generation needs. The saltwater distillation plant, in particular, is a major electrical drain, and the PM-3A was able to entirely power that facility. Unfortunately, the PM-3A operated for only 10 years before developing a number of cracks and water leaks, forcing it to be decommissioned in 1972. All power generation then switched over to diesel, and most of McMurdo still relies on a series of 500 kilowatt diesel generators to this day. 3 Enercon E33 wind turbines were introduced in 2009, reducing the need for diesel by nearly 500,000 litres annually, but these turbines also suffered a major failure, and their output was reduced to just 66% by 2019. So despite efforts, McMurdo Station is still entirely reliant on the annual fuel deliveries made by the United States. And speaking of deliveries, the process of getting supplies to McMurdo is no small task, requiring a coordinated effort on multiple logistical levels. US Coast Guard icebreakers make the journey, smashing a channel through the frozen oceans into McMurdo Sound, thus allowing additional supply ships to follow and make deliveries to Winter Quarters Bay. In this fashion, the US provides roughly 42 million litres of fuel and 5 million kilograms of supplies, including dry and frozen food, construction materials, scientific equipment, and whatever else is needed. Additional supplies and personnel travel via air from Christchurch, New Zealand, 3,920 kilometers away. Other nations operating in Antarctica likewise get their deliveries through Winter Quarters Bay, demonstrating just how important McMurdo is to all scientific operations on Ross Island. But of course, survival is as much a psychological problem as it is one of avoiding death by freezing. If you intend on staying in McMurdo, depending on the season, you're agreeing to spend much of your time indoors, and if you do venture outdoors, you will be surrounded by an endless frozen landscape. But not to worry, McMurdo does actually operate a club, a bowling alley, a barbershop, and even holds a music festival. Rather famously, the New Year's Day Ice Dock event is held annually, featuring various musicians from McMurdo and Scott Base who perform for those who care to attend. As far as other luxuries go, modern inhabitants at McMurdo are really a lot better off than those who must have suffered acute levels of cabin fever in past decades. The radio station AFAN McMurdo, American Forces Antarctic Network, started broadcasting in 1963 and has been live ever since. But up until 1973, this was the only widely available form of broadcasted semi-entertainment, with the radio station as much about providing weather updates as it is about playing music. In 1973, AFAN-TV began broadcasting vintage US television shows until the 90s when McMurdo officially got honest-to-goodness cable TV. Following that, the station also got a reportedly spotty but still usable internet connection, and although primarily for transmitting scientific data, access to the internet means that those stationed there more or less enjoy most basic luxuries, relatively speaking. But if you were once again starting to get the impression that being in the Antarctic is a lazy Sunday browsing YouTube videos, let's step back and get a bit of perspective. A quick look at the local death count should be sobering enough, with the number of those that have lost their lives in the region only getting higher with each passing decade. We already mentioned that Antarctica is aggressively seasonal, but let's understand what that really means. The most often cited tragedy occurred in 1979 when Air New Zealand Flight 901 collided with Mount Erebus, killing all 237 passengers and 20 crew on board. Now, the details of this accident are rather complicated, and it wasn't necessarily the Antarctic climate that caused the disaster, but this is just scratching the surface of Antarctic air disasters. The overwhelming number of all deaths in the region have occurred due to plane crashes, and the majority of all plane crashes have occurred due to various climate conditions. The most recent major disaster occurred in 2019 when a Chilean Air Force C-130 en route to deliver supplies to King George Island went down for unknown reasons and took the lives of all 38 people on board. There are far too many plane crashes and other fatal accidents to cover in detail, but let's just say that Antarctic deaths range in the thousands, and none were due to natural causes. At this point, it's probably not too surprising to learn that McMurdo Station has a clear relation to a ship called HMS Terror. You have to wonder if calling an exploration ship the Terror isn't just asking for trouble. It clearly was, though, with the case of HMS Terror when it set off with its flagship Erebus in 1845, the pair tasked with officially establishing a Northwest Passage. Let's not get confused. The Terror was previously a warship, hence the name, and its infamous failure attempting to find the Northwest Passage happened on the opposite side of the world to McMurdo Station. Prior to that, the Terror had achieved the successful Ross expedition between 1839 and 1845, headed by English explorer James Clark Ross. It was during the successful expedition that Ross Island and the McMurdo Sound got their names, Archibald McMurdo being a lieutenant on that occasion. Another English explorer, Robert Falcon Scott, established a base camp on Ross Island in 1902, one that's still there to this day and referred to as Discovery Hut, located at Hut Point on McMurdo Station. As far as the station itself is concerned, it came about in 1956 as part of Operation Deep Freeze. The Earth's poles were very much still seen as the last unexplored areas of our planet at that time, though a number of daring expeditions had been launched during the late 1800s and early 1900s. These missions of discovery gave rise to the so-called International Polar Years, during which various nations banded together to tame the inhospitable regions and establish some sort of human presence. The first International Polar Year took place between 1882 and 1883, the second between 1932 and 1933, and the third, otherwise referred to as the International Geophysical Year, between 1957 and 1958. A fourth did technically occur as recently as 2007, though these things today get much less attention. Either way, the 1957 expedition was significant because it marked a time when Eastern and Western nations were again willing to share information, this formality having previously been severely limited due to the Cold War. So when a total of 67 nations agreed to not only participate but also to share information, it was a notable occasion. As said previously, McMurdo acts as the hub for the other 55 countries that operate a variety of seasonal and year-round Antarctic research camps. The most well-known smaller research station is run by New Zealand's Scott Base, located around 3 kilometers from McMurdo. But this does raise a rather interesting point. Antarctica is one of the few places where a stunning percentage of the world has all agreed to work in close proximity, support one another, and share information despite nationality. And this is all due to the groundbreaking Antarctic Treaty. Perhaps not too surprisingly, the Antarctic Treaty is another leftover of the Cold War. As part of the establishment of an arms control agreement, the region was officially designated an exclusive scientific reserve. This means that no country may use Antarctica for anything other than research, with firm restrictions applied to any military activity, including nuclear tests. The Antarctic Treaty was opened for signatures on the 1st of December 1959 and officially went into force on the 23rd of June 1961. The original 12 countries to sign the agreement were those that had participated in the previously mentioned geophysical year. Since then, a total of 56 nations have signed the treaty, 55 of which utilize their right to operate a research station in Antarctica. Now, 7 signatories have technically claimed land in Antarctica, but importantly, that land is still completely open to all signatories, and various nations operate research stations within land technically claimed by other countries. Most fascinating of all, in line with the original treaty, all countries share research and information openly, demonstrating perhaps one of the most under-celebrated cooperative achievements in the modern world.